Welcome, gentle listener. I am Baldermort, and I wish to introduce you to the forces, factions, and features of the Warhammer 40k universe, the grim darkness of the far future. We continue our exploration of one of the most important features of the Warhammer 40k setting, the Psykers. Have no doubt, gentle listener, they are the very bedrock of much of the setting. Many elements have been clearly envisaged from other sources, pilfered, purloined, and then repackaged, and realized in a grim and dangerous way. For every folktale, every heroic cycle or pantheistic myth is represented somewhere here in the Warhammer universe, but that is quintessentially Warhammer as well. A large amount of repurposing of the threads and visions from other genres or fiction to be put into this huge smelting pot that somehow makes so much more of the many ingredients. It truly is more than the sum of its parts. And it is in the Psykers that we finally wrestle with one of the most important parts of this escapist setting, mysticism and magic. For they are in this world in such vivid and bountiful abundance. Nearly every taste is catered for somehow. From one side you have the heavily armoured Marines, the futuristic Eldari, the avalanche that is the Orcs, and all exhibit their powers in a very sci-fi way, with named abilities and disciplines, the usual forms of telekinesis, telepathy, electrokinesis, and beyond. The usual fare for the settings of the future. There is also the other, the more ancient, that still firmly inhabits the settings. The herbalist who creates potions, the enchanter who infuses objects with runes, charms, and glamours, the geomancer who is attuned to the earth, and the druid who worships the sun. Ancient grimoires abound, and antediluvian libraries containing secrets and circles and spells. The wisdom of old, and the hate and spite from the dawn of darkness, all is here, and we shall explore these elements, these wonderful features of the setting in due course. But all good things, eh? For it will take time to do it justice, to get it right. Now you will note that I am never being direct, as I wish to give the mood of the entry, the pace and purpose of this video, for I do like to show instead of telling. I find it more entertaining, more easy to get into, and that is definitely the aim, because no element of this hobby should be a chore. Now, concerning some of my stories, some will say, where is the lore? But I would just like to point out that I consider the tales to be more elucidating of the setting and the lore than any extract I might quote and end quote. I'm willing to wager, and will do a test at one point to check my hypothesis, as I construct all of my tales to not only shine the light on the subject which we discuss, but also to impart a greater knowledge of the universe that goes in easily and allows people to learn without knowing they are doing it. Also remembering that I am no guru. This is just my take on the many sources I have read, and I make no claim to being a lore master either. I am merely your guide, your starting point. And to which I would urge newer players or fans of the setting who listen to or watch these videos to then proceed to the comments section if you have any questions. I do try to get to them, but you will often find that older hands have decided to slum it in the kindergarten here, and will often veil others of their phenomenal knowledge of the lore. So do scroll to see if any wisdom is there, for nobody knows it all. And here on the guides we are a community, a show to be sure, but one we all hone together. So get stuck in, but always be polite, for we gather around a fireside of camaraderie and friendship. So ask, but ask the whole, not just the bald. I do not know everything and will never pretend I do. Now, with the extended throat clearing out of the way, let us proceed into the lore and some observations and pearls of what I hope are only the beginnings of your own wisdom. Today we shall be discussing Psykers in relation to humanity, the Imperium, and what and why this has come about. A quick recap. Psykers, mystics, wizards, all are names for the humans of the 41st millennium and beyond who have a connection to the Imperium, the warp. They can draw parts of that realm, its energies, and use it to ignore the laws of physics, create effects and display powers far beyond those possible for a normal human. The more pyrotechnic we will see later, but the abilities of these beings are as varied as the stars, but may be honed, guided, trained, or even punished into obedience and then mastery of a function that supports the Imperium, the vast empire of humanity that covers the map of the Milky Way galaxy, numbering over 1 million worlds, and trillions of populace. Psykers are considered mutants and are deviations from the genetic norm for humanity in general. They are seen as the most dangerous of all mutants due to their connection to the Imperium, the warp. They have existed from the dawn of time, but were always incredibly rare, only bursting into common occurrence circa 25th millennium, and this contributed to the tumult of the Age of Strife. Now, with the opening of the Great Rent across space, which throws out waves of psychic energy like never before, bathing the Imperium in its influence, the occurrence of Psykers, psychically gifted humans, has exploded. Even as far back as Rogue Trader, the very first manual for Warhammer 40,000, the evolution of the human race into a more psychically gifted species was forewarned and feared by both the Eldari and humanity. Now that old promise has arrived, and our race is in the beginning of that genetic renaissance, or road to the deepest, darkest pits of hell, depending on how you view things. But at least the human race of that time, the modern era, 40k, has some knowledge, has some experience with the effects of Psykers in their societies. For the entire human psyche, the overall culture has been deeply and irreparably scarred by the Age of Strife, also known as Old Night. I hope my example of the threats of emerging Psykers from the initial story reflects the severity of the situation. Now imagine that tale, and things like that happening across the entire galaxy, and doing so for 5,000 years. Old Night indeed. It is aptly named. Thus are Psykers feared, and rightly so. It is not easy to be friends with or to give succor and support to a person who has the equivalent of a planet-cracking explosive weapon hidden inside their minds, but we shall get to that later. For the time being, let us continue in basic terms. If Psykers are so dangerous to have around, why do they exist in the Imperium? If the Empire of Humanity is so callous, why do they not just exterminate them all? Well, they do for quite a few, I can tell you, but they have so many uses. Yes, they are a ticking time bomb, but they are also tools to the impossible, and humanity now requires these abilities more than ever, as we have lost the birthright of our people, technological innovation and scientific inquiry, logic and reason. The age of the Imperium is certainly not one of enlightenment and reason, and I'll explore this more in the entry for the Imperial Creed and the Ecclesiarchy and Inquisition, which should start sometime soon-ish, but let us not divert too much. So, just skimming over the context, let us show you how pathetic our people now are, that they are required to lean on the crutch of wizards, curses, and incantations. Psykers. Humanity cannot travel without Psykers. Full stop. All of the drives that move the fleets of the Navy are reliant on tearing a hole into warp space and then moving into it, flying through the pits of hell, always hoping that the Geller fields will hold, and that the Psykers you have are able to guide you to your destination, seeing the equivalent points for your destination in the warp via the Astronomicon. Then the vessel rips another tear and comes back into real space. Quite a dense paragraph, so let's unpack it a bit. Amongst mutations, there are sometimes strains that become more stable and are considered a subrace, what the Imperium call abhumans. The Navigator gene was developed, and it is presumed that it was placed within some humans, and they were genetically modified on purpose and at their agreement. The goal was to create a strain of humans that could see into the warp. Many Psykers can touch it, can feel it, can use it, can banish it, but not many can view it. Those that do usually lose their minds swiftly. But Navigators have a mutation that gives them a third eye in the center of their brow, their forehead. When they open it, they can see the warp, harrowing and less controlled, and their minds are very disciplined to survive it. But their third eye also protects them in many ways from the worst of its mind-smashing effects. Now, each starship that uses a warp drive has at least one Navigator on board. The ship will go into the warp, as travel there is magnitudes faster than in the real world. But the warp is chaotic and illogical, and without pattern, as we have discussed in Part 1, Psykers, souls, and the warp. Now this is true, so the Navigator must have beacons that they can see to give them a bearing, an equivalent place to where they wish to go to, or are at, in the warp as corresponding to the real world, the Imperium. Once, there was said to have been a huge technologically advanced network in place during the Age of Technology, but now there is only the Astronomicon. The Astronomicon is a huge beacon in the warp that is given off by a device on Terra that was designed by the master of mankind, the Emperor himself, and is powered by his soul and his will. Alas, it now requires so much power that many low-level Psykers are sacrificed to power it each and every day. See my entry on the origin of the Emperor for more details. The Astronomicon is a blazing star in the warp, and is the lighthouse by which all navigators use to estimate their position in the warp. Without the navigators, there would be no faster-than-light travel, and the Imperium would cease to exist. Navigators are thus humanity using Psykers to make up for their lost technology that permitted travel before, despite it using the warp back then as it does now. But we shall get more into that as time goes by. Communication. Although the speed of light is very nifty, it would still be nigh on impossible to coordinate the Imperium at the rates involved. Think of the distance in light years. Years. So it would take multiple years for any communication to get anywhere, let alone back with a response. Now that's all well and good in many settings, but in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, these delays mean the extermination of entire systems by any of the various xenos, traitors and horrors that inhabit our galaxy. No, there has to be a faster way. And there is. Alas, humanity has lost this technology as well, so are relegated to using Psykers. Telepaths, basically. They are called an Astropathic choir. Psykers who have been specifically trained and guided so they can throw messages through the warp to others of their kind on far-flung worlds. Thus, they do sometimes gather to enhance the message, hence the word choir. Sometimes it would take many such Psykers acting in concert to punch a message to a warp storm or other anomaly, and it is not safe by any means. Many a choir has had their eyes explode, their teeth shatter, their brains melt, or their souls shriven from them by receiving the wrong message from the wrong mind. It is always a risk. But there is a real need for training, as everything that is sent through the warp is very much thought and feeling, not words and structures. So the astropath must not only think their message, but must also feel it, must imagine it, and give it form and feature, if it is to retain any hope of getting to the other side of its journey, even moderately accurately. So when a message is received, it could be a jumble of images that the astropath may have to put back in order, as it has been warped and twisted in transit. It could be a set of feelings and impressions that inform of danger or threat. It could very well be a solid message, like a song, the words faint but clear. But then it could be a shadow of a song, sent by a denizen of the warp. Without astropathic choirs, the Imperium would be headless and unable to react to the thousands of threats they receive every day. Psykers all, the choirs are indispensable. Now, how on Terra are the astropathic choirs strong enough to pierce the veils of the warp and get a message through? How are they able to touch the warp for long enough to do this and not be either too weak as to be ignored, or so strong that they are not then immediately targeted by the myriad threats I have said reside there? From chaos demons, enslavers, vampires, etc., etc. I can answer that question in 2 words. Soul binding, also known as soul forging. Now sometimes a telepath is so strong-willed, so centered, so incorruptible, so powerful, that they do not require the protection of soul binding. But as I said, they are rare. A good proportion were required to be soul forged. But what is it? The process of soul binding is where a vast number of Psykers are trained to the nth degree, prepared bodily, always being healthy, prepared mentally, understanding the sacrifice they make and the import of what they do, prepared psychically, enduring rigorous testing to amplify their abilities and skill with it to the pinnacle of their potential. This takes years to fulfill to the exacting requirements of the experience, for to fail in this trial is to have one's mind shattered, one's soul overawed for all eternity. It is said that these people are then brought into the psychic presence of the Emperor. In that one meeting they are bathed in his glory, touched by his light, and a slither of it is imbued into the very soul of the Psyker. The Emperor binds the mind of the Psyker and blesses them with his majesty, that they would be more proof from the blandishments, more inured to the horrors, more robust in the face of the adversaries that stalk the dark corners of the warp. In this way, they are not only augmented, their powers enhanced to hitherto undreamed of proportions, but they are also inoculated from the powers of chaos. There can be no immunity to those dark gods, not even under the aegis of the Emperor's own soul, but it will help. It will strengthen and toughen his warriors of light, his Adeptus Telepathica. Alas, the payment for wisdom and power, as old one-eyed Woden will tell you, is the eyes. The Psykers trade the sight of eternity for the nerves at the back of their eyes. Near all who are soul-bound are blinded by the immense display of power, as their minds cannot contain their energies and these delicate nerves just breach. They burn out. But most who survive the forging, the binding, are able to sense the world around them in a way that replaces the sight they now lack. The increase in their skills more than makes up for this. Even so, to be an astropath is a confusing and grueling role at the best of times, an incredibly dangerous one at the worst. And as they are so important, they are often the first targets in any military confrontation, the first minds assailed by a demonic entity, the first to be targeted by assassins. Well, perhaps after the Navigator. Just perhaps. And we mentioned the Adeptus Telepathica. This is the official name of the branch of the Administratum that covers most issues with Psykers. It has control of the black ships that scour the worlds of the Imperium for its tithes of Psykers, taking by force those who misuse their abilities, recruiting for the many roles. Those who survive the experience with the black ships and are not deemed too weak to be useful, those have the fate outlined in my Origin of the Emperor video. Those strong enough, skilled enough, are then taken into the Scholastica Psykana. For there are many other uses of Psykers in the Imperium. But I can hope you can see the existential level of importance on these first two types. Without faster-than-light fleets, and without communication, no empire can thrive, nor even survive in this, the most grim and dark of all dystopias. Great, isn't it? And here we get on to defense. Or aggression, whichever. Fight fire with fire, they say. And the Imperium does this en masse. Against the powers of chaos, against other Psykers, against mystics and magics and spells and curses of all sorts. It is really only the use of the exact same powers that can stem them at all, let alone make them go into retreat or smash them. The dangers of chaos are a constant cost. The chance that one of the Psykers could be overwhelmed and used as a vessel for a malevolent spirit, possibly then going on to create gates into hell all of their own. But it is the Psykers of the Imperium that are best equipped to engage them. A Psyker can fight other Psykers on their own ground, under their own rules, with powers equal to their own. They are trained killers, honed weapons, and they fight in near all of the branches of the Militarum. Some examples only are, for the Imperial Guard, the Astra Militarum, there are the Primus Psykers. For the Adeptus Astartes, the Space Marines, there are the Librarians. And finally, there are the ultimate expression of the weaponized human Psyker, the Grey Knights. Adeptus Astartes, Space Marines all, Psykers all, and they are of a line that hails directly from the Emperor's own genes. And of course, there are those Psykers who serve Holy Inquisition, either in a retinue or as a fully fledged member and operational Inquisitor. To differing extents, with differing specialities, these collected efforts represent a huge part of the defensive and aggressive strength of the Imperium. There is an abundant amount of information on the many schools of combat disciplines and support abilities that can be at the disposal of a commander, from the mobs of Psykers of the Militarum to the psychic warriors that are the Librarians. Few things can turn the tide of a battle as swiftly or decisively as the correct use of the psychic power of humanity under arms. I can assure you I will be doing more entries on these very soon. But it shows that the Psykers can be guided in a certain direction much of the time. But also never forget the other uses of these beings when they are trained correctly. The bodyguard who can read the minds of the crowds, the mind dicer that can eviscerate at range, the clairaudient or clairvoyant who can see through time and space, or into the future, as some can do with the use of the Imperial Tarot, but that is a subject for a later entry. I have inferred or outright stated that many Psykers can be formed, trained and moulded into a certain school, but also stated that this may not be the whole of the tale. Well, it is my reading of the lore that insinuates that most Psykers could do most things if they were trained well enough, but they are usually a tad lazy and double down on their gifts, or are actually so weak that their only attribute is the one thing they can do. If this is a lack of mental agility, imagination, ability to emote or control emotions, or a lack of connection to the warp is debatable, but it is a very important point. Perhaps all may be in play. But it is true that most people will lean into their given advantages and make the best of what they've been given, as it is said. Thus it is, in my opinion, for Psykers. It can also be said that from a certain point of view, that all mystic training and incantations or spells are actually just methods to get the Psyker to believe that they can do the thing the spell states it achieves. They act as a doorway to suspend their own disbelief, so to put it. If the spell says it can be done, then done it can be. But as I stated in the previous entry, there is also a strong element in Warhammer that is truly Gothic horror, and thus all ancient languages, incantations, sigils and summonations are based on events and reality. So magic languages, unlocks and hexes, if performed correctly, do work. But it can be stated that the majority of them would have their roots in calling on powers of the warp that are actually listening, hence meaning the dark gods of chaos, Khorne, Tzeentch, Grandfather Nurgle and Slanesh, or other lesser beings. For all magical effects come from the warp, and it is not very well right now, as we have heard. But I hope to get into this in more detail in a following video, the dark mysticism of Warhammer. I hope you will join me then. I have been Baldermort, your faithful servant. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion about Psykers. If so, then please do consider liking and subscribing. If you do, then hit the notifications button, as I would not want you to miss out. Now, no matter what you do today, do try to make time for fun. Toodaloo.